Hi everybody and welcome back to Be Like Christ. Let's talk about why the Old Testament is so misunderstood. When you think about the Old Testament, what do you think about? Well, the first thing that I typically think about is the things that I learned in Sunday school growing up as a child. Those stories that are always so popular, stories about Moses and Daniel in the lion's den and David and Abraham and some of these great heroes of faith that lived in the Old Testament. One thing that's interesting though is that when you open up the New Testament, read books like Galatians or Hebrews or Romans, what you notice is that a lot of times the New Testament writers speak about a lot of the negatives of the old system, the Old Testament. And a lot of times that leaves us scratching our heads thinking, well, wait a second, everything I learned in Sunday school was good about the Old Testament, and now the New Testament is sending me mixed signals and I don't know what's going on. What's the Old Testament really about? And I think part of the reason the Old Testament is so misunderstood is not because of what we studied in Sunday school, those great heroes, but actually because of what we didn't study in Sunday school. What you'll find if you look at the Old Testament proportionally is that the stories about these great men of faith actually only make up a small portion of the Old Testament, and yet they're the stories that we tend to focus on the most. What you'll find is that some of the bigger books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and some of the other prophets, they make up a large section of the Old Testament, but we don't always study those books. Why is that? Well, because they're boring and repetitive, and I don't like them. And I'll be the first to admit that I am not the first person who just dives into the book of Jeremiah and says, oh yeah, let's get through these 60-some chapters and we'll have a great time. They're not as interesting to read, if you want to put it that way. But what's important about these books is that they hold a very crucial message to understanding the New Testament. The story of so much of the Old Testament that we often think is boring and repetitive and only talks about how angry God is the inability of God's people to keep the law that was supposed to make them holy like God. When the New Testament talks about the negatives of the Old Testament law, what they're referring to is that human beings tried on their best effort to become holy like God was, and they failed over and over and over again. So the New Testament is something better that's going to make people righteous and holy, not by their own merit, but by the grace of Christ. The Old Testament is kind of the foundation for why we need something better, a better system, a better sacrifice for our sins. And without an appreciation for that, you're never going to appreciate Christ as much as you could. And so that's why it's important to study all of the Old Testament, not just the stories about the great heroes of faith. Because understanding it all will help you put the pieces together as to why Jesus needs to step on the scene when we open the pages of the New Testament. Thanks everybody for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, do that and comment down below if you have any additions to this video that you've thought of or any questions. Also, like the video, share the video so other people can see it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.